for coming out to learn a little bit about Lynn Gault, who some of you knew. Raise your hand if that's true. Okay, we had a few folks in the room, half knew him. So I'm Bethany, the director here, and I had been asked earlier last year to do a talk for the Bascom at their Clay Symposium, which was earlier this year. And I chose the topic of Lynn Gault, and in doing so, I was able to not only take a look at some of the materials that we had in the archives, which in fact were not as broad or as deep as we maybe would have hoped. But the reason for that was that a lot of his materials were at the Southern Highlands Craft Guild Folk Art Center in their archives. And some of his early papers and writings and a few other things were deposited at UNC Special Collections in Chapel Hill by Lee Davis and his partners. So I got this opportunity to go to Chapel Hill and read some files about Lynn Gault, mostly his early years, which for me in some ways are as exciting as what he ultimately contributed here for the folk school. I'm not so sure that the folks that went to the Bascom's Clay Symposium were as excited about him as I was, but what I'm going to do is, unfortunately I'm going to read a little bit, but give essentially the same talk as I gave at the Bascom, but with a few details X'd out, and I would really like to invite anyone who has some more fill-in-the-blanks, some stories to tell or objects to show, that you please absolutely either butt on in, or at the end we can have kind of a conversation on storytelling from your perspective. Because I don't get the color, I don't have the color commentary that the folks here who knew Lynn would have. I just have the stuff that comes out of the archives and the images. So you're going to see some gaps in his history in terms of images, because we only have so much access to so much, and the things that are only really relevant to his craft. But you might see a few images that are interesting to you that you've not seen before. So this is Lynn up on the slide here, up on the screen. While those connected to the folk school know that he is important to us because of his founding of our clay program and all the other ways in which he played a leadership role here at the folk school, he's really actually much better known by those who knew him outside of Brasstown for his work in the theater. In fact, he has a great deal of connections to some of the groundbreaking theater professionals in the state. At Playmakers Theater at University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, and at both Manio and Cherokee, where two of our outdoor theater programs were founded and still exist today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, but know that he is, of course, very, very important to our evolution as a folk school, our culture, and to our community. Although I have to admit that I'm not so sure he would claim all of the credit that we might give to him in some ways, and he might take credit for other things that we don't necessarily fully know about. So again, I welcome any stories that you have to fill in some blanks. So Lynn Gault was born in North Jackson, Ohio in 1912. So let's, just for context, I believe that Olive Dame Campbell was already on her trip with John C. Campbell by 1909, right? Or this map was at least done by 1909. So he was still a baby when Olive Dame was thinking about the folk school. His dad was J. Ford Gault. He was a civil engineer who for much of his career managed a lumber company and that lumber company was called the H.H. Lynn Lumber Company, and his mother was Ida Lynn, E-I-T-A, I think that's how you pronounce that, Ida Lynn. And obviously, Lynn was named for both his mother and the lumber company. So North Jackson, Ohio, is in Mahoning County, which is technically an Appalachian county, part of Appalachia. And at the time, it was really, really rural and agriculturally focused, much like Brasstown was. I think today it has a little bit more industry or industrial tone to it than it did when Gault was living there. Sorry, I realize I've got double-sided pages here. So Gault was really familiar with rural life. And rural life became a theme in his writing, which he started out doing at Carolina and didn't much finish in his later years, didn't much spend time writing, but it was a theme that he constantly returned to in his writing and in the environment that he chose to live in for the rest of his life here in Brasstown. In an oral history interview that is now at the Southern Highlands Craft Guild, Gault said that he showed an affinity for art as a child, and that he enjoyed drawing and doodling like most kids do. He wasn't really into clay. He didn't really know much about it, but he must have seen enough about it and know enough about how to shape it, because he was fascinated by his dad's turntable. It was probably some kind of phonograph that his dad had. And apparently, when he was young, he did take something really sticky, kind of like clay, and first learned to turn it on that turntable, much to his father's chagrin. But drawing and painting was really where he first found his artistic skill. So he knew early that he was artistic, and he convinced his family that he should go to art school, which is not something that normally would have happened in, say, the 20s, when he was ready to go to school, especially on the cusp of the Depression and so on. It didn't seem like a career, but he wanted to go, and so he was able to attend the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he entered school in order to study visual arts. But when he was there, he figured out he wasn't going to be a painter. He said he wasn't meant to be a painter, and he knew that within the first year of studying. But he still demonstrated some amount of facility, and I'll show you a couple of images here. These are a couple of self-portraits, one of which I believe Lee Davis still has in his collection. One I think he donated to us. This one? Are both of these in our collection now, Susanna? This one is, yeah. So this one, he's much younger, but these are self-portraits, so he did demonstrate some facility. And this is a print, an etching that he did, and is really quite skilled or skillful. This was from 31, I believe, is what it says. But he didn't pursue it. The tediousness of fine art might have been something that turned him away from it. He was clearly someone that needed stimulation, that enjoyed stimulation. And he found that when he was in Philadelphia, that he enjoyed working in the theater. In fact, he and a friend of his started sort of created a play and started a theater company, and his father helped to fund it. But he really liked applying those painting skills that he did have, not to paint paintings, but to paint sets, to design sets, and to use them in other ways in the theater art. So in 1932, he was assistant director of what was called the Morning Star Marionettes in Philadelphia. And like I said, it was supported in part by his father. And this was in the Depression, as you know, and the programs for the performances, which you can find in those papers at Carolina, were actually mimeographed on the unprinted sides of pledge sheets that were from the Mahoning Valley Boy Scouts of America chapter's National Good Turn Initiative. So this must have been something that he had been involved with as in his in high school, but had saved those pages, and they were used to mimeograph his programs. So obviously recycling kind of took a different form back then in the Great Depression. So maybe his father, upon hearing that he wasn't going to be much of a painter, suggested that maybe he should return home to Ohio, because ultimately that's what he did. He returned home to Ohio before getting his degree in Pennsylvania, and he transferred to Youngstown College and then to Hiram College, both in Ohio, where he graduated with an AB. He graduated with an AB from Hiram. And by 1937, he had decided to enter UNC Chapel Hill's MFA program in the Department of Dramatic Arts. So he committed at that point to the theater. 1937 also marked his first visit here to the folk school. He attended what was called a short course back then, and this was usually a recreational course, and recreation back then meant primarily music and dance of some kind. And so he was involved in folk dancing and music here. He likely would have been exposed to other kinds of crafts while he was here back then. And he did become acquainted with Olive Dame Campbell at some point, although they were not necessarily close. He just became acquainted with her. And he eventually claimed that she had been the one to encourage him to go off and learn pottery and bring pottery back to the folk school. It's also true, though, when he later told her that she had been that person and that she had encouraged him to bring pottery here, she said she did not remember that. So, but likely it was her. I'm going to skip through some of these slides so you can see some other images of him. This is him in the military, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. Oops. Sorry. Wait. Okay. Actually, I'm just getting ahead of myself. So we'll leave it right here. You can imagine what he was doing in the military there, and then I'll tell you. Okay, so at UNC, Gault studied under some of those theater greats that I was mentioning before. Frederick Koch, who is referred to as the father of American folk drama. He studied under Paul Green, who is a very renowned writer and playmaker in North Carolina. He tried writing plays himself, and he received pretty good marks for his playwriting. And many of his plays, you're told to write what you know, so he knew the Midwest, and most of his themes were about agricultural life in the Midwest and in Ohio. His thesis was entitled Goats, a Middle Western folk comedy. Goats are definitely worth some comedy. He also wrote but never published a novel while he was while he was doing his master's degree, and that's fairly common. You take different kinds of writing classes, and then you find out what you're good at. And he found out he was good at plays. He also found out that he was really good at designing theater sets, at directing, and at acting. He started working in outdoor drama in college, and there's some wonderful videos at Carolina online, a couple, they're just two, and they're silent, that show the playmakers, the kids from this MFA program, packing a bus, it looks like a school bus, high with sets and poles and all sorts of things, and then driving off into the sunset to produce some outdoor theater performance. He was able to work at the Lost Colony in Manio during his summers. Of course, that's only a summer program. But he started out as technical assistant in production in 1938, and he actually stayed with them through 1947. as a technical assistant or technical director as he was eventually promoted. One of UNC's campus publications way back then when he was in university noted that Lynn Gault was a quote-unquote jack of all arts. He plays queer musical instruments, sings, acts, paints, and writes verse, fiction, and drama. So he was very well known for being an eclectic in the arts. He finally received his master's from Carolina in 1939, and then he taught briefly at Hiram College, and then also at University of Virginia. So this slide is when he joined the Army in World War II. He served in the Signal Corps and also in anti-aircraft. He was deployed in the Pacific Theater on Okinawa and also in Korea before being released in 1945 with the rank of captain. He then returned to the outdoor theater in Manio, where in 1947 he was responsible for building and rebuilding, all of the sets because Manio had experienced a fire and it had destroyed all of the sets at that time. So they got a refresh thanks to Lynn Gault. And then he also joined that same year in 1947 Playmakers Theater Company in Chapel Hill as scene designer and technical director, and was well noted for his scene design and his acting and his teaching and his mentoring of up-and-coming Playmakers staff. So he had a really big impact on what still today is one of the premier theater companies in the Southeast. So how about Clay? We'll pause here. After much success in Manio, in 1950, Gault was actually recruited way across the state to Cherokee to serve as the very first set designer for Unto These Hills. Very first set designer. Now, there's two things remarkable about this. It's the very first, number one. Number two is that he wasn't a Cherokee. And in fact, that play was not really written by, staged by, planned by indigenous peoples. It was thought to be something that would benefit Cherokee and benefit what was called then the reservation. But in truth, most of what happened with the play was not involved much, wasn't decided upon much by members of the tribe. This has changed very recently, and it's much different in terms of its narrative, in terms of its costumes, sets, all aspects of the play. But the time was that this is how things were going to happen there. So it should be something that he would have been proud of. When he was not on the set, Lynn took pottery classes at what was called the Indian Agency. I think this was probably an extension agency of some kind, likely that was funded through the federal government. And he had access to these classes during the day because they worked at night. And he was really good. He excelled, and eventually he was given the key to the studio by the teacher to work after the class was over, because the class was only about 2 hours long. So he spent lots of time in that studio and perfected some of his technique there. He really took to it like a new friend. He ended up working 6 to 8 hours a day on clay every day before returning to the set at night. So it strikes me that if he was able to do that, spend 8 hours of his energy on clay, and then goodness knows how many how many hours at night working on the play, he was likely a little bit manic, right? A little bit hyped up all the time. Somebody who can manage to be so skillful and focused on two very different art forms at once had to have a different kind of energy. Sometime during the early 1950s, he also attended the School of American Craftsmen in New York, and it's not called that anymore. It's now part of the Rochester Institute of Technology's School of American Crafts. And there he studied under Bauhaus-trained Franz Wildenhain. Have you ever heard of that person? Anyone who's a clay person in the room? Yeah? Other connections he made and that influenced his development as a potter included Edwin and Mary Shire, who worked primarily at the University of New Hampshire, and then they moved to Oaxaca in Mexico and did a lot of work there. And this is important because of some of his later activities. In 1952, Lynn moved to Brasstown, and this is what you're seeing on the screen, a scene from his backyard, I believe. And he, quote, bought a little old house, tore it apart, remodeled it, built an outdoor kiln, and went into business. He named his studio in his business Birdfoot Ridge Pottery. Does that ring a bell to folks? Yeah. He quickly became popular in the area, and as Olive Dame Campbell had encouraged him to do, at least so he said, he taught the first ever clay classes at the folk school, but since the folk school didn't actually have a studio, a wheel, a kiln, he actually just taught students at his house. So those were not folk school classes so much as they were his own. So I'm going to breeze through a few of these slides so you can see what his home looked like then, and maybe you can shout out whether it looks familiar. You can see the hand-built kiln. And I know Sienna's like, one day we'll have one of those again that works. So he used a kick and paw wheel, and you can see it wasn't mechanical. Kick and paw meant that you kicked it forward, you pawed it back. And you can see or imagine what the motion would be here, watching him at the wheel. He used the wheel. He also did some slab work, but he would never use molds. It's something that he kind of decried. He felt like it was cheating, I guess. He said, the molded piece does not have the life or the feeling and spontaneity as does the piece made on a wheel. He made glazed and unglazed work. He experimented with lots of cutting and cutouts, and I'll show you some of those images in a minute. In fact, his lanterns, does anybody have a lantern, a cutout lantern here? Those apparently became extremely popular and now are replicated in lots of ways in the area and outside the area. He always saved any scrap he had for his own pug mill. He really enjoyed the process of mixing clay. So a pug mill, I only learned this because I had to look it up. And I don't know if we have one technically, yeah. We have two. So you put dry scraps or maybe even wet scraps in this thing, and then eventually you might add some water, and it's a machine that will mix it up or remix the clay so that you can actually recycle those scraps, right? Much like he recycled the paper from his Boy Scouts. We'll breeze through a few of these other slides so you can see how he worked. I imagine that these were done for an article or maybe for his work with the Southern Highlands Craft Guild, because these are quite nice photographs. He was handsome, wasn't he? And you can see how extraordinarily productive he was, too. Lots of large form pottery. I mean, not gigantic vessels, but he did a lot of big bowls. I'll stop there and I'll explain this one in a second. You might know who these folks are, right? In terms of his materials, Lynn Gault really preferred stoneware and porcelain. He didn't really like earthenware quite as much, although he did work in it. He really liked materials that had some fineness to them, even though there might have been some limitations to some of the colors that you could use across the different clays. He liked subtle, subdued colors. And then he also liked, on the opposite end, rich colors. He used a mixture of fire clay and kaolin, flint and feldspar, and quote-unquote that sort of thing, he would tell all the reporters. He liked to mix it and age it a bit because the older the clay, the more the bacterial growth and the greater the plasticity. And I learned this from Sienna, who I really appreciated talking to, so I understood what he was saying in his papers. He said when you do this, when you let that bacteria grow, it gets a little bit smelly after a while. It smells a little bit like a creek bottom. And that's one way of telling whether the clay is any good. And I imagine also it was one thing that felt good, to smell that real earthiness of clay, and to be reminded always the place that you're in. He didn't, though, dig local clay. It was something that a lot of people just didn't do. They didn't have time. They didn't know how. And they didn't know where to find it either. And so I actually appreciate that Sienna last year was able to arrange a wild clay mentorship program so that we can start imparting some of those skills again and learn how to identify clay and how to dig it and then how to process it. Lynn fired everything outdoors in his kiln, which you saw, at 2,400 degrees. He sought a reduction atmosphere in which the flame is overloaded with carbon, and this is his words, these are his words, being hungry for oxygen, steals it from the clay and glaze materials. This allowed him to experiment with oxblood glazes, and we'll show you some of what he did with those glazes, and celadons, or gray greens, that were at that time kind of uncommonly used. He described the reds as very difficult and chancy, but he did okay with them. Not that he's so crazy about it, he said, it's just that they're so hard to do that they challenge me. He was always up for a challenge. In terms of form, Gault was most interested in ceramic sculptures, and he loved making kind of unusual pieces, and you'll see that in the slides. But he sold mostly his utilitarian pieces. These, the biggest selling items, he said, were ashtrays, cream and sugar sets, cocktail cups, and covered jars. So we'll go through some images here so you can see. This is actually him. I believe this would be at the folk school. I just can't tell where. Might this be in the library, or if anybody knows, you can see a Granny Donaldson quilt or tapestry behind the lamp there. This would be Lynn with the very large recorder. Recorders were a big deal for quite a while, right, here at the folk school. And then Otto and Marguerite.
And Lucille next to
Lynn. Is Lucille the person who is on the...
She's right next to Lynn.
She's right next to Lynn. Okay, great. So Lucille's his wife. Thanks for pointing that out. I don't think I knew. So that's a really wonderful picture of him. So here he is working again. As he aged a little bit, you could see he was really into these large form bowls, one of which we have in our History Center. And you can see in the back some of his lanterns, these cutouts. And they seem very dated because they are, right? This would have been in the 60s, maybe the 70s. And some of these pieces you'll actually see in upcoming slides. And this would be an example of a booth that he would have at the Southern Highlands Craft Fair. And I'm just going to pause here for a second. I think I'm going to pause here for a second. No, I'll keep going. It's another view from his booth. Okay, I'll pause here. So, going back to Cherokee, while Gault was there, he admitted that his greatest, and that's where he learned, and he would always credit his art to that time that he spent in Cherokee. He was there for decades, in the summers with the play. But he also said that his greatest influences, in addition to the teachers that I had mentioned before, were Chinese and Mayan pottery and sculpture, and the work of Edwin and Mary Shire, who I mentioned, who befriended him, and he spent a lot of time in Mexico visiting them. And this is important because you'll see some indications that Mayan heritage and other influences of Mexican indigenous cultures in some of his works. He really likened pottery to scene design in some kind of fashion. He said, it too is satisfying and a challenging art, and the audience is important for the success of the artist. He liked having an audience, which must have been why he enjoyed the theater so much, of course. He also said of the process that pottery is probably the most unsure of all the crafts. You don't know what you've got until you open the kiln and see the finished product, is what he said, and he didn't always like what he saw. In May of 1961, he received a Playmakers Alumni Award from Carolina, and a paragraph from the citation on that award says, in his studio at Brasstown, North Carolina, hundreds of pieces of pottery have been smashed to bits because through some tiny flaw, they have failed to meet the high standards of perfection by which his work is always characterized. Fortunately, many hundreds of other pieces, a majority of which are considered collector's items, have survived their creator's sharp scrutiny and are proudly displayed and used throughout the country. I spoke with some friends of Lynn Gault, and they said, yeah, he would open up a kiln, he'd see one broken item, and he'd just smash the rest because it just would anger him and disappoint him. And they said, candidly, he drank a little bit, but also he had some other challenges in his life that may have found themselves directed at broken pottery or into broken pottery. So I'm going to show you some images here and then stop and tell you a little bit more about his leadership. These are in no particular order except color, perhaps. So across the years, you can see that his style changes, and you can only tell that from the black and white or slightly reddish or clearer photographs, which ones are more modern than the other. But he had very different styles that he experimented with. And I suppose, much like fashion designers would, he'd roll out a form or a particular kind of glaze and sell that for a while and then try something else, as a lot of potters do. But he seemed to be really focused a lot on shape, and these shapes where you would see something lift up and out of the top, some kind of finial, maybe it was just a handled jug or jar, but this shape here, I'm using my cursor, I don't know if you can see it, yeah, shows up not only in lids, but in other ways, and you'll see that. You can see his eclectic glazes, stencils here. This might hearken to either Cherokee imagery or Mexican or Mayan. I think we have a casserole dish like this, is that right?
I think the one is Lee Davis.
Lee Davis, yeah. Okay. An orange glaze here. And then we're starting to get into the reds. And this would be this oxblood red that he would experiment with that I mentioned a minute ago. And I'll pause here and tell you a little bit more about Lynn. So the Southern Highlands Craft Guild, as you may know, was co-founded by Olive Dame Campbell and a number of other women and others who were leading craft revival institutions like the Folk School or Penland, what is now Aramont. And Lynn was in on it pretty early in its founding and became a lifetime member of the Southern Highlands Craft Guild. Some of the images that you're seeing here are, as I mentioned at the beginning, part of the Craft Guild's archival collection, either the images or the actual items themselves. But from 1956 to 1970, something that I didn't know about until I was doing this research, Lynn Gault was also was a co-founder of and part of something called the 12 Designer Craftsmen. It was a cooperative of 12 craftspeople who opened up a shop in Gatlinburg, which is where Aramont is, and Aramont had its own, craft shop there, but there was lots of tourist quality crafts that were sold in that area, and not all of it was actually made by people from the area, from Appalachia. And so Lynn and his compadres wanted a quote-unquote true native craft shop, even though he also was not native to the area, but that would showcase classical materials and forms of Appalachia. So they focused on the quality of materials, they focused on craftsmanship, they eschewed tourist objects, probably still sold their fair share of ashtrays, but their focus was to be more of a fine arts place to go. And that in and of itself is something that I think everybody wants to see when you're talking to folks from the folk school or Airline and others. We want to see fine craft again be something that people want to buy and not go to mass-produced, pottery and that is made internationally and shipped here instead. But to be honest, the real reason that they founded the shop, 12 Designer Craftsmen, was because as a cooperative they could control their profits better than as members of guilds or as being represented by other shop owners. So, in fact, he said, as long as I can sell in our own shop everything that I can make, I don't quite see going out of my way to sell at 50%. And what was happening at the Crafts Guild, the Southern Highlands Craft Guild, is that they couldn't keep his stuff in stock because he preferred to take his best things to Gatlinburg and sell it there, where he could get most of the money for it instead of only half of the money if he sold it at the Craft Guild. This did not make the Craft Guild very happy because he and these other 12 artists were talking about this. But to be clear, cooperatives were something that the folk school founded as a means for true economic self-sufficiency or a way to generate greater self-sufficiency. It is a model that people experiment with from time to time, and they can be very successful, but they can also be very hard to maintain because it requires volunteerism. It requires a commitment to the mission and a commitment to constantly feeding the sales with your products. And eventually the shop did close. But it was really quite something for them to have been able to keep it open for almost 15 years. So I'm going to continue showing you some of the work here. This is beautiful, isn't it, that red? Have you ever worked with red, Sienna, in this way? Yeah. But again, you can kind of see this lifting towards the universe. You can see the influences of his trips to Asia in the handle here and even the shape of that pot. Here you can see, I think this is celadon and that oxblood glaze. Is that possible, Sienna, that you can have both at the same time? Or Alice, maybe you can, do you know? But it's quite impressive when you see it in person. And one of these jugs is currently on display at the Southern Highlands Craft Guild as part of the folk school's 100th anniversary
I do know
exhibit.
what's happening.
Yeah.
Where it's not red is where it didn't reduce.
Where it didn't reduce.
It turns green instead.
Okay, so that's not a green glaze. That's pretty cool.
Because the
Yeah.
archibald that's in, yeah, it will stay green.
Yeah.
That we use in the studio. That stays green.
So here's the top of the lid. This would be porcelain, I'm assuming, at least the white. I don't know behind, it's kind of hard to tell. This is one of his zodiac bowls. I believe this is the one that's in our collection. And it's really quite wonderful. And while he hated molds, I'm kind of curious how he developed the images of the zodiacs, the relief there. This was one of his classic lanterns, and I think you can actually go down to a craft shop now, and you'll see very similarly shaped and cut lantern features, and I honestly believe that he was an influence on a generation of potters that have experimented with this form and used different glazes for each. Here's some of his sculptural work. Also, these are lanterns, but you can see they're outside. Not all of them necessarily stayed outside, but some of them were meant to. And some of them are really just wild, right? This feels like Mayan form. Also maybe a little otherworldly. He played a lot with this black glaze. And he had these birds, or maybe that's a dragon. It's probably a woodpecker. But kind of looks, again, they kind of look like they could be from another time. And these look like stone, but they are not. And I'm showing a lot of these because I was showing them a lot to the Bascom crowd who's there specifically for clay, but also because of this change in his style and his form, and the differences between the things that would sell and the things as utilitarian, bowls and mugs, cups, and those things that were really just interesting him and that just interested him in terms of form. He didn't do a whole lot of figurative, like realistic figurative, but he did do some mask-like forms, and he was influenced, I believe, by a mask collection that the Shires had in Oaxaca, and that's currently on Lee Davis's wall. And then I love a series of these. They're mother and children, faceless children, but something, they remind me a little bit of those figures that we see, the moon-faced people.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
In the museum down
Yeah, that's right.
in Moon Eye.
This one especially reminds me of that, yeah. And so here's Lynn at another one of his craft fairs. So briefly, to sum up some of his other leadership here at the folk school, I'll mention that Lynn also worked in stained glass, and he learned copper enameling from the masters. And we don't have, I think, anything of his enameling. We have one piece, three or four pieces. There's more at the Southern Highlands Craft Guild, and I think he did sell pretty well there, but he really primarily worked with pottery, but he liked to play. He played in lapidary arts too, and also in silversmithing. He was a mentor to Lee Davis, who is also currently a lifetime member of the Southern Highlands Craft Guild. They're not practicing anymore. and he was, of course, the coordinator of the Folk Schools Clay program for quite some time, once it was formalized on campus and we actually had a studio environment. They were quite close friends. He served on the board of the folk school. He was an original founder of the Brasstown Concert Association, which will have a concert here on Sunday at 2, still in existence today. But something that does not continue today is called the Brasstown Community Theater. Does anybody here remember any of their performances? Do y'all know anything about it?
I think they were in the big barn, weren't they?
Well, I don't know. I don't have much information about that. But so yeah, maybe they were in the big barn. That would be actually a great idea for us to continue in the future. This stage behind me was built by Lynn Gault. So our way of doing performance and showcasing all sorts of talent and skill was facilitated in part by him. Although we probably would complain about these drawers quite a bit. I would also mention that in 1952, so this was really early on when he was involved in the folk school, he adapted Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol for the stage reading. And that annual reading continues today, although the form, the actual script has changed a little bit. If it weren't for Lynn Gault, I'm not sure we would be continuing that tradition, that we would have thought of it, that we would have the basis for it. And so he's left a lasting influence in that way. You saw a picture of Lucille, his wife, who I think when they first got together, she was working as a dietitian at the folk school. But I also understand she was a teacher in Murphy. Is that the case? Did you say Spanish?
Yeah.
Spanish teacher?
French and English.
French also.
French and English? So she was in languages. She died in 1981, and there was a very, very sweet announcement of her death in the archives at UNC. He died in 1998, so he lived quite a few years longer. As I mentioned to you, he was a writer, and so I'll close with a poem that I thought was kind of intriguing, that I found at Carolina. It's a very brief poem, and it goes like this. It has no title. Small houses must have big doors, you said, to get a coffin through. Small hearts must have their openings, too. I'll leave you with that to think about, and a couple of other images, the last ones that I have here. Of Lynn older at his wheel, doing some stained glass. And in a more formal pose. Makes him look like a science teacher. So, all right, that's what I've got for you about Lynn Gault. And I would like to invite, first of all, do you want to actually pass around or show the pottery pieces that you have here? Kathy, thanks for bringing those. And anything you want to say about them, feel free to use the mic.
Be careful. It's pretty heavy, too.
I don't remember where I purchased that, somewhere around here, but Lee Davis gifted me with this, and this appears to be slab work in that black glaze, and it's a bird.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is really neat.
Yeah.
Please be careful. Anybody want to tell a story about Lynn? Fill in a blank for me. Or Lucille.
Well, I mean, it's heard me say this. But my first folk school experience was Lynn Gault doing Christmas Carol in front of the fireplace.
In the library or in here?
In the library.
In the library.
Probably say library. And then Lucille later. And my mother, loved, we had many things from the folk school in my home growing up.
Mm-hmm.
She disapproved of me hanging out here later, but
But you like collecting the work,
she
huh?
did.
Lucille was a teacher at Murphy High School, and I guess she roped him in. He was the stage manager for the senior play. I guess this would have been in 59 or 60. And it was our town was the show. And if you're familiar with it, it's a real Spartan stage with step ladders and whatnot. But he borrowed from Chapel Hill or someplace a control box that was like a rheostat, so that the floods could come up and go down as it went from one side of the stage to the other. And that was the most high-tech piece of theater equipment that had ever been. The auditorium for it was the old Dome School building that's no longer there. That was the same architectural design as the Jimmy Carter museum in Plains. I think it was the same thing, so it was upstairs, but it had rake stage and fixed seating for, and I don't know how many you sat, but that was where the senior play was. And he was, besides directing it, he was the character of the stage manager for the play.
Life imitating art, or art imitating life, right? Yeah. Anyone else have something to share about Lynn Gault? Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for listening and learning about this extraordinary person who I think symbolizes the way the folk school can help individuals synthesize their many interests and find a place for those many interests and feel comfortable exuding those interests, experimenting with them. Because artists can be fickle, but at some point he decided this is where he wanted to be rooted. And I don't think it just had to do with, having a wife, right? And who also needs to be rooted somewhere. But it was because this was a place that enabled all of those pursuits and more. So thanks very much for coming, and come back next week for, I don't know what presentation, but every Wednesday we're doing these 4:45, learning more about the 100th anniversary. Do you have anything you want to say,
No.
Susanna?
Next week is collections highlights from the archives about the craft revival.
Okay, and Susanna will be doing that presentation. That should be a real thrill. Okay, thanks everyone.